I'm more or less scripted tonight because you would be here until 1 in the morning if I weren't. I tend to have to look for words. Anyway, tonight I am going.
Microphone, do we need it?
No, I don't want it.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to present my very personal view of vocation. I hope that some of this will resonate with some of you and that some others may be able to perhaps springboard it to a different way of discerning vocation, and that the rest of you, you know who you are, will refrain from making rude gestures and funny faces, saying rude things. Oh, gee. So to this end, I'm going to tell you some of my own story of what I perceive to be a calling, and why for the most of my life I saw that either by my own doing or by the doing of others, the calling fell flat on its face. Can everybody back there hear me all right? Okay, all right. I don't want you to miss a word. Now, in several sermons, Robert has touched on the power of negative life events to get a grip on our souls and embed themselves into us like ticks and spread their poison. And these are often things that have wounded us in some way or confounded us or in some other way chipped away at our pride and our sense of self-worth. And it's curious that the lovely things that happen to us, the things that bring us joy, can be so fleeting, and that these miserable things can continue to haunt us throughout our whole lives. I've been a performer all my life, and I've gotten lots and lots of accolades. I've gotten scholarships. I've got pats on the back. I've gotten people who were heroes of mine who would come up to me and say, "Oh, that was wonderful. You did such a great job, blah, blah, blah." And I can remember those situations, but I can't remember them physically. I can't remember them viscerally. I can't remember the feeling I had when this happened. On the other hand, one cross look, one false move, one shame, one embarrassment, and I'm still carrying those around even now. And when I was putting this together, this first story called Vocation Fail Part 1 was so intense that I actually started shaking thinking about it. So this is the case with my first encounter with a failed religious vocation. The summer that I was 6, I was in a class led by Sister Benedict. She was a strict, no-nonsense nun of the type that you described, Joe, when you were talking to the
Sister
nuns.
Maria Vicious.
Yeah, okay, got it. Sticks with you all your life, doesn't it? Yes, right. But she had been pressed into service that summer with one purpose, and that was to teach us the Baltimore Catechism. Yeah, baby. Yeah. We were told that memorizing the first book, remember what color it was? Blue. Yay, got it. All right. Then it was necessary for us to memorize this to be allowed to receive our first communion. So nearly all of us who were in that age group were in the class. Now, we found out later, of course, that was a bald-faced lie. There was nothing that prepared us for being for taking our first communion except showing up. But anyway, this was the party line. Now, Sister Benedict's method of teaching, and of all the nuns who taught us in our religious education classes, we were not in a parochial school, so we did not have nuns who were teaching nuns. We had nuns who were very, very competent, wonderful nurses from the hospital. They were great, but they were not teaching nuns. They never allowed us to ask questions because they never wanted to field any questions. So, and this is true. I mean, I actually heard this secondhand from them. They had said this to someone. And so that their method of teaching was memorization and, a kind of recitation from them, which we were not allowed to question. Anyway, her method of teaching the Baltimore Catechism involved a strict rhythmic reciting of the text, and this is kind of how it went. She took a pencil with an eraser, and she tapped on the table, and then had us rather sing song. Who made the world? Who made the world? God made the world. God made the world. Who is God? Who is God? God is the creator of heaven and earth and of all things. God is the God. So it went until we got to God is the creator of heaven and earth and of all things. Now, in this class, it was understood that nothing was to deflect our attention from the simple task of memorization. Nothing was expected of us other than that, and we asked nothing else of Sister Benedict. No explanations, no clarifications, no questions. So it was kind of a surprise. I think it might have been in the third class or so that she stopped this class right in the middle, and she turned to the boys. Of course, the boys and girls were sitting opposite. I mean, yeah, and she said in this kind of enraptured tone of voice, "Boys, I just want to tell you something about an exciting opportunity you have waiting for you after you make your communion. You are going to be able to prepare for something that will allow you to serve God in a very special way. Father Smith will ask you to take special classes with him, and you will learn how to become altar boys. And if you accept this honor, you will be right beside him, helping him serve God as he says Mass." Now, by this time, the boys' eyes had all kind of glazed over. I think they all thought they were going to get a new basketball hoop on the side of the rectory. But boy, did that excite me. And I knew what these guys did. I saw them. I watched them every week. I admired their choreography, the way they looked in their cute costumes, and best of all, they got to speak Latin. Now, I was no stranger to any of those things. I liked to dress up. I could handle dancing around on the stage. I never dropped any dishes. And I already knew how to speak Latin because I had been in the choir for a year and we sang a lot of Latin in those days. It didn't matter that I didn't know what it meant, but I knew how to do it. So in my excitement, I raised my hand and I shook it around all wildly. And she was kind of surprised, I guess, that anybody would dare to say anything in the class, but she did acknowledge me. And I blurted out, "Sister, after our first communion, will we be able to learn how to become altar girls?" There was a dead silence. Totally dead. A couple of the kids started to giggle and snicker a little bit, but they suddenly realized that some terrible thing had happened and that there was going to be a lot of trouble brewing. And so they even shut up, and the silence got worse and worse. Sister Benedict glared at me as only one other person in a classroom was done. There was a college professor who hated my guts for some reason, and he used to glare at me all the time. But she looked with this smoke coming out of her ears and the fire coming out of her eyes, and she said very slowly, "Young lady, I want you to stand up and march yourself out that door. Sit down on the steps and think about what you have just said." I left that room in abject shame. I went out, as I was told. I sat on the steps, and I thought about what I had said, but I had nothing. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. Nada. It was like, what could I possibly have said? Besides, I was a good candidate for this. The guy she was talking about would go out and back of the church and say dirty words. I didn't do that, So after a while, I realized nobody was going to come for me and let me come back in. So I got up and walked down the hill and went to my father's store. I knew that what Sister Benedict had failed to tell me, my father would. And my father and I had already been engaged in a conflict with the church the year before and the teachings. And so I knew my father I knew my father was smarter than the nuns, let's put it that way. And that he had ways of explaining things. And he did. I learned that morning that there were no women priests and that girls were not welcome to serve on the altar. And for a couple of hours that afternoon, in between customers, my father, who was a devout Catholic, explained to me how precious women were, how capable and accomplished they could be, and how shameful it was that the church failed to recognize this. I asked him why, and he said that the excuse was that Jesus had only called men to be his disciples. He also said something that would stick with me for the rest of my life, obviously. I think, he said, that the reason Jesus only called men was because he had to. He didn't have to call the women. They were already there. Or else they would show up on their own later on. Big lesson learned that day. Any questions about my early life? If we have time, I'll tell you what nuns, between my father and the nuns was. But okay. So here's Vocation Fail Part 2. After leaving my home parish to go to college, I separated myself from the Roman Church. The role that I had played for all those years was as a church musician, and quite frankly, at that time, in the early 60s, the jobs had, for a large part, dried up. There were churches that were selling their organs to raise money. You probably all know this, when the guitars came in. And I had also lost the belief that salvation was only available through the Roman Church. In college, a woman's college, incidentally, I had made almost all of my spending money performing, and a lot of that was done soloing in well-heeled Protestant churches with well-maintained organs and talented organists. And then for a while, I accepted a job, kind of a long run, with the local Salvation Army. I took the job as a service pianist because it was surprisingly well-paying, and it was steady work. And although I didn't have much truck with their rigid fundamentalism, I admired their history of outreach and their kindness to people and their commitment to women in the church. In fact, in that particular little outpost, there were only 2 women who would be considered clergy. No men involved at all. For the next few years, I went from one usually small mainstream Protestant church choir directing job to another one, depending on where I was living and what was available during the time. I saw a lot more women in positions of responsibility and occasionally authority in various churches. And then in the early 70s, back in upstate New York, I got a call from a college friend who lived in the area. She and I had performed together all during college, and we loved working together. She asked if I would be interested in a singing job, okay, as a section leader in a motet group that was just being organized. When she told me the hours and the salary, I was frankly astounded. Talk about landing in the pot of jam. And it wasn't until I arrived at the first rehearsal that it became apparent that it was indeed a church choir, not some secular early music motet group. So welcome to the Episcopal Church, Alex. If only as a mercenary. I was happy, I was comfortable, I was not particularly plagued by notions of any calling either. And I guess that's what happens when you get too comfortable. But then one day in 1974, Does anybody know what happened?
I graduated high school.
Okay.
We graduated.
Yes.
Philadelphia,
Yes.
1974.
Philadelphia 13.
11, well,
Was it
they
11?
call them the 11, yes,
Eventually.
were ordained. Illegally? Yeah, sure. But in obedience to God's will, according to the participating bishops. The rest, they say, is history. And in my father's eyes, a long, shameful history. And suddenly those nagging old stirrings started up again. Now, I'd like to say that I pursued these immediately, but family problems and things that were going on in our lives just made that impossible. Fast forward again about a decade. I'm now living in New Jersey with a new husband, 2 more kids, and a new job at a parish in the New Jersey diocese. After a while there, I had finally decided to make my commitment to God's frozen people official. And I would be received in the next confirmation class. We had
What bishop?
Bishop Pettit.
Okay, right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. We had settled on sessions every few weeks. I had to meet privately with the rector because I was the only adult in the class. So we settled on these instruction sessions that were supposed to be about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes every few weeks. And our first meeting, we talked for a while, and he sent me home with several books. And I was so excited. I think there were 3 books, and I think I went through them in 5 days. I was so excited by what I was reading. I was so excited by the idea of getting together again and talking about them. The subsequent meetings grew longer and longer, some of them lasting for a couple of hours, and the armload of books became heavier and heavier. And the notion of vocation again started to needle me. And the miracle to me was that now it was actually a possibility. It could become a reality. I never mentioned this to the rector, but one afternoon, just before the bishop's visit, we sat down and there was a little quiet, and he said, I want you to think about this. And I said, what? And he said, have you ever thought that you might have a calling? And he then told me, I was kind of like, maybe, I didn't want to go too deeply into what I was feeling at the time, but I acknowledged that I had some stirrings. And he said that if I wanted to pursue this, I would have his total support, and that there were several others in the parish to whom he had already talked who would be behind me. Now, this came as a real shock. I was truly astounded because I didn't know that anybody in the parish gave 2 hoots about me or knew me even. The people in the choir knew me. The parents of the children who were in my junior choir knew me. And that was about it. So I was really surprised. And there was this sense of validation, that was so wonderful. Again, something I can't conjure up in here, though, unfortunately. So I went home. Our family was going through some serious problems, some distress. And I talked to Bill, my husband, Bill, about it. And he said, if whatever you want to do, he said, I'm behind you. And I said, well, I do know that this would be really rough on us at this time. And he said, to be honest, Alex, yes, it would. It would be very rough on us. But if this is what you have to do, this is what you have to do. I spent time thinking about it. I did talk to some other people. And everybody said, gee, if you really feel this strongly, maybe you should do it. But I realized in the end that the kids would really suffer if I had made the decision to go to seminary. So I had to say no. And this was a real kick in the gut moment. The wind knocked out of my sails, and I had done this myself. I couldn't blame it on Sister Benedict or some, foot coming down out of the sky like Monty Python, This was me. I had taken myself out of the running. But the stirrings would continue much stronger over the years, and they would bother me. And then one afternoon at a barbecue, a retired priest friend of mine and I were talking, and he gave a little wry laugh, and he said, well, Alex, with the exception of the obvious, what on earth could you do as a priest that you can't do now? In that moment, I got the notion that I might have had a false view of what vocation was all along. I wasn't sure how to articulate this, but I thought there was something in what he said. I thought there was so much in what he said that I think it's significant that I never asked him what the obvious was. And in the years since, I've thought about what the obvious was, and I've given it 6, 7, we could probably have as many answers as if I went around this room. People might say, well, this is what a priest can do and you can't do it. This is what a priest can do and you can't do. But I think I just didn't want to know. So the stirrings didn't really stop, but they got less annoying because now I knew that maybe I was on the right path by having been on the wrong path. And so then a month or so after that, I received something from a priest friend of mine, and I'm going to use his name because he would not be at all annoyed that I used his name. The Reverend Gary Bloomer was a very good friend of mine. He died last year, and he had what one might call a horrible career as a priest. He would call it that. He was very open about it. Well, he was very open about everything. Gary had no filters whatsoever, which was part of the reason that he had a really awful career as a priest. I received this big sheaf of papers in mail one day. And then he called me and he said, did you get it yet? And I'm like, did I get what? And he said, my sermon. And I said, oh yeah. It's like 3 days later. The last thing I wanted to do was read like a 8-page sermon. I said, well, read it now. And I'm like, okay. I actually took it out while we were on the phone and started reading it. And I got to this point, and it changed everything for me. The lead into this is that he's on his way to deliver his 50th anniversary sermon at his home parish in Wisconsin. At O'Hare Airport, he meets a bishop from Tennessee, and they get to talking. And he tells the bishop asks him where he's going, and he tells the bishop that he's going to deliver his 50th anniversary sermon. And he talks about how awful his career has been. And the bishop says at the end, well, I guess you made it anyway, didn't you? And he says, is there anything for me to celebrate about today except you made it? And the question, would you do it all over again? My answer to that is no, I wouldn't. And one of the blessings God gives to each of us is we never have to live our life over again, good, bad, or indifferent. But if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. And the right question that should be asked is, could I have done anything else with my life? And the answer to this is also no. I'm just still an old-fashioned high churchman who does not believe he is just another professional, but that life is a vocation which God calls one to. It is his will, and I must do it, and I did. And that's the poignancy of somebody's vocation, somebody like Gary, who got everything all wrong, and still was there because that was his vocation and he had to do it. After I read that, I was suddenly sure that I had misjudged the whole meaning of calling, that what I was suffering from wasn't a failed vocation here or a failed notion of a vocation. It was collar envy. I wanted the little costume. I wanted the dress and the little blouse. I wanted to do the choreography. I wanted to carry the little cups around. I wanted to look pretty. And I wanted somebody to hear me. So this got around to my whole notion of, does God have a plan for us? You hear that all the time. And I thought, well, this is a big part of the calling. Does God have a plan for me? And I started to think about all the prayers that, you ask for something, you don't get it, blah, blah, blah. And what does this mean? How do I know what direction I'm supposed to go in or something? I boiled it down to my rather vulgar way of putting things, down to sperm and egg. God had a plan for me. Out of all those trillions and billions and gazillions of sperm, there was one that met billions and millions of egg, and the two of them are me. Do I need anything else? I mean, how you got all that? I mean, it's kind of hubris to ask for anything. And I was thinking about this 2 days ago, no joke. I opened up my computer, and this is on the opening page of Firefox. And it's from the best source of all. You're going to quote somebody to boost your feelings about God and your meanings about God. Take it from the most famous atheist that's out there. This is from Richard Dawkins. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, God, for giving us Richard. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will in fact never see the light of day, outnumber the sand grains of Arabia. Certainly those unborn ghosts include greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively exceeds the set of actual people. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you or I, and I love this, in our ordinariness that are here. Wow. All he's missing is the God factor. It's there. And, it's sort of like my feeling, one of my favorite things in the whole story of Jesus's birth is the visit from the Magi. Because the Magi come because they're astrologers. They get the word from studying the stars. They come for all the wrong reasons, and they come to the right place, and they go back changed. And that's kind of this, God must have sent us Richard Dawkins for just such purposes as this. So after God's purpose, I started thinking about, well, then what is a vocation? And of course, as Robert has pointed out through this entire series, and the reason he called me in the first place was not to have me do this. In fact, one of the things he said to me is, of course I wouldn't ask you. Well, you know where that put me. You know why I'm here. Okay. So, but the notion that we do have a vocation, and that is quite simply to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is this, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, folks, I don't know about you, but I sat there this afternoon at a typewriter trying to pull this sort of thing all together in some form that I could read. And my whole heart, my whole soul, certainly my whole mind, and certainly my whole strength were not focused on God. This is the hardest vocation that we could possibly have, and yet it's ours. It's our vocation. It's the one that we are commanded to have. We're not just called, we're yelled at. You do this. This is your vocation. And I think for the rest of my life that I'm going to have a hard enough time just following that vocation. Anybody have any ideas, any notions? Is there time? There is one story that I'd like to hear. Jerry, would you tell us your story? Because you all know Jerry, but you may not know this this part,
Well, I can tell part of that's relevant to what you're talking about.
Yeah, the part, where
Try not to make it too long.
Jerry, can you come over here? No stress.
This was a side of Jerry that I had not known. I've known you for a while. How many years now? 2 years? I'm a lawyer. I'm retired now, but my career was devoted to child advocacy. I represented the Division of Youth and Family Services. I was with the Attorney General's office, and we dealt with cases of abuse and neglect. And I love being a lawyer. I love being in court, which is where I mostly was. I loved working with the social workers and trying to figure out these problems. But there came a time when it was so painful, and all of the situations that we were dealing with were so seemingly, to me, hopeless. And the children were getting the worst of it, no matter how you looked at it, no matter what idea you had for making things better. All I could see was these hurt children and hurt families too, hurt parents, but children with no resources were very, very hurt. So I was constantly feeling this pain of their pain, and also the frustration of not having my professional skills helping them, not being able to facilitate the work that the social workers were doing, not bending the courts to my will, which is very painful. I felt, and now, having listened to Robert for so long, I felt completely powerless. And I thought, well, this is maybe not the right thing for me to be doing. And, I love church. I love scripture study. I love to pray. I love spiritual practice. I had a wonderful church that I was part of. I was part of a wonderful group that we met all the time. And so I started thinking, maybe I didn't think I was being called, but I was to do something else. Maybe I can just pray with people. Maybe I can do something that's not, causing me so much pain. But more importantly, I'm at a dead end. Maybe what I have to do is just pray with people. So I thought, maybe that means I have a call to the priesthood. Seems strange. It wasn't something like Alex. It wasn't something I thought about my whole life. But anyway, so the process of discernment at that time in the diocese was to start with your parish priest, which I did. And he referred me they had a list of priests that you could talk to. So I went to see that person who suggested, we had many wonderful conversations, but he suggested that I do a retreat not at the convent here, but the Episcopal Church convent in Mendham, St. John Baptist community. And I met with Sister Suzanne Elizabeth, and we spent several days together. And she was, why do you think this? And I said, well, it's just, I can't, I'm fighting all the time. It's so much, anger and aggressiveness, and she said, well, you're trying to do something good. I said, well, yeah, but it's just not, it's not working. And I hate thinking of myself as someone who fights all the time and gets in people's faces all the time. And she said to me, well, what makes you think that's not what God wants you to do? I said, well, because it's horrible and I hate it. And she said, wow. And you think that being a priest would be nothing but, like great, wonderful, profound experiences. I said, yeah, I kind of do. And she said, well, she knew that I was Irish.
like Alex, Alex's maiden name is Halloran and my maiden name is O'Halloran.
And we spell it
I
the
was,
same way.
we were destined to meet.
We
But
could
anyway.
actually do our dance
We-
after.
But she knew that I was Irish, and she said to me, have this vision of yourself as a Celtic warrior. You're a warrior. That's what you're supposed to be doing. God gave you this gift. You love to go into court and fight. I mean, I don't like conflict, but in court, as Ford, who's also a lawyer, said, there are rules. It's combat with rules. It's okay. And it's true. So anyway, she said to me, your calling from God is staring you in the face. And so that was very good advice. And I left actually, consistent with these stories about how, you go through a lot of silence and you end up in a place of peace. I never again thought that I had a calling to do anything other than what I did.
Tell them about your daughter. This was significant to me because of what happened with my family.
Oh, well, my daughter, who also is she has a gift of fighting, but she really, and it's good because she's a lawyer and her thing is trying to get people to do what they don't want to do. She's a civil rights litigation. She's very aggressive. It's a very aggressive practice and she's great at it. But at that time she was young. And she had a very close friend whose mother was a priest. And she said, Mom, don't do this. I said, well, I'm just thinking. She said, no. She said, Charlotte, that was her friend, said, oh, if your mother or father, probably, but her mother was a priest. She said, if your mother is a priest, she belongs to everybody but you, and you'll never have her to yourself again. So anyway, but that was an interesting thing. It was a very poignant thing for her to say. But the real reason was Sister Suzanne Elizabeth telling me it was okay to fight, that that's probably what God wanted me to do. So
Thank you so much. I'm just going to throw this out to anybody else. Does anybody else have the springboard here? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to share something with everybody. Feel that, like what you were saying before, that the two greatest callings that all of us should have is to love everybody equally, like we want to be loved and love God, right? You just said that. That's the calling.
Yeah.
So how many people here think that God is great, right? God is great? Do you guys believe in Satan? Anybody? I don't know what the, yes?
Yes.
So
Yes.
you're only as great as your weakest link, right? And Satan is the weakest link. So God has to be greater than him, and he needs him to bring us all together, right? To prove that we can be better people. When you're at work, when you go out and you're I don't know, you're in your job and you have someone that isn't doing the job properly, and you get frustrated and you're like, I can do a better job than they can. Well, if you can, guide them and show them, hey, maybe this is a better way to do it, and don't get angry at them, because your kindness to them is going to make them have a better day. They're going to go home and be kinder to their kids, right? Because if you're mean and nasty, be like, I told you not to do it that way, they're going to go home and be angry, and they're going to take it out on their kids, right? And it's just going to create a cycle of I don't know, negativity, where you guys go out there and spread positivity, right? And I think that's our greatest calling, whether you're a priest, nun, lay person, is just to love from your heart and be kind to others. You don't know what they're going through,
That's that second commandment. The second commandment is like unto us, Yes, love your neighbors.
So bring that weakest link up with you.
There you
right?
go.
Have them.
There you go. Anybody else? Yeah, Marie.
Okay. I have issues with the notion of God having purpose or a plan, because from my experience with my relationship with God, it's not so much a plan, but an evolution. And you don't know where that's going to take you. So I don't see God giving me a specific one-dimensional plan.
You have involvement in that.
Yeah, like creativity, but because he wants us to use our imagination to glorify him. So I hold a lot of stock in the fact that he calls it, we are his image, in his image. And that means that we can be creative like God is creative. And that's just my take on
Amen.
I think seeing ourselves as being created in his image and seeing others as being created in his image is extremely important. I think too often what we do is try to make God into our image and, try to tell God where to move and tell God what to do. And we lose sight of the fact that we're the creatures. Anybody else? Robert? Nothing
Oh, I
from
have
you?
lots to say, but,
What?
a lot to say.
Oh, say it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to thank you so much, Alex, for a
Sure.
brilliant. Thank you. That was just really, really wonderful.
was hoping you-
Alex and I were at the bishop who ordained me to the priesthood. Al, don't fall off your seat. At his funeral, it was John Shelby Spong, and we were at his funeral together. And the preacher quoted from Bishop Spong as to what our calling is, and it's really quite lovely. He said, "Our calling is to live fully, to love wastefully, and to be all that you can be." And I was thinking as you were talking of that wonderful story in the novel Evensong. What's funny?
I thought that was the army recruiting.
I know. I thought the same thing. I know. I couldn't get over it either. But that's what he said. Yeah, be all you can be from the army. But Gail Godwin wrote a novel called Evensong, and in that that she defines what vocation is. Vocation makes more of you. Yeah, that's right. It's this. And there's something kind of anti-Christian about that because, we want to sort of step aside and let Jesus move. But when I step aside and let Jesus move, there's more of me somehow,
Yes.
right? I mean, isn't that the paradox of it? There's that sense of rightness of like, oh, yes, it's flowing, and the Spirit is moving and I'm right where I'm supposed to be. I don't want to be anywhere else but right here, right now. It's a splendid sense of calling, right? It sort of echoes through so many different traditions of kind of understanding that and cultivating that sense of calling. Obviously I think in a humorous and somewhat sarcastic way, but I think that becoming overly preoccupied with the question, does God want me to go to Detroit or to, Des Moines, is like a smokescreen in a way from the true calling, which is to love wastefully, to live fully, And if I can get so kind of blinded by the narrowness of the Ouija board, show me your woo, reveal the mysterious plan, then it I can, kind of what Carol was saying, it allows me to be more bitchy, and I've lost that very fundamental question. How am I kind of reflecting the nature of Christ's love in this moment? It's such a gorgeous thing. So that's all the stuff that, boy, does, clearly a person doesn't need to be ordained to do that. And, I love the idea of veiled vocation because if you notice, that was my question so much for each person, particularly the ones from traditions where they're most sure. Yep. Have you seen somebody feel passionately sure that this is what God wants and they're wrong? I asked Novella that, and she kind of didn't. I mean, she wasn't dodging it. It's just that she got caught up in another question I was asking. And, I think that the way that, not to get too ecclesiastical or Episcopalian, but the way that we pick bishops is so much more illustrative of the way that God works. We end up with like 5 people who say, I believe I am called to be Bishop of Newark. I believe it strongly, And the church says, we hear one. We hear one. We can authenticate one, you know. So in some senses, I feel more called to the priesthood by the church than I do by Jesus. You know, my call around Jesus was not to be a priest; it was to love him and to receive his love. You know, that was the calling that I received when I was like 4. You know, clear as a bell, and because of my like horrid lack of imagination, dress up was in my future. Yeah. This costs $1,600, by the way. It's custom from England.
And isn't he wonderful to loan it out?
to lowly nuns. So.
Well, I had one, I made a lot of notes, and some things I threw out because of time and whatever. And this one, I don't know why I ever let this go, but I'm going to close my portion right here with this. It is our vocation to live the vocation, to live the call, to follow the directive, to love God and our neighbor, whether in a collar or a habit or a thong bikini. Yeah, Lord, you want to see me.
And I just wanted, Alex spurred me on, and I just wanted to end with a story as well, a little less racy. But it's, like I grew up as an evangelical Southern Baptist where there was a lot of God's plan talk, and it still has a hold on me somewhere. And there are those moments where things seem to part and rays of sunshine come, and you're like, wow, well, that is not from human hands, and those happen, not reliably, not all the time, but. And I don't want to presume that I know more than God about such things, And there are times when you just kind of want to step back and take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. And I want to, and I got to dance. So if I stutter a bit, because there's like slightly confidential kind of things about this, but obviously everybody knows that I'm yeah, turn it off. Just in case. Maybe one or two of you know